Hello, good evening, and welcome to this online seminar hosted by Blaydes Maritime Centre of the University of Hull. My name's Martin Wilcox. I'm a lecturer in history at the university, and I'm the convener of sort of Blaydes Maritime Centre seminars. And it's my very great pleasure this evening to welcome my old friend and colleague, Dr. Jo Stanley, back to speak to us once more. Jo, as I'm sure many of you will know, is a prolific maritime historian and very much a historian whose work has focused on, as she, I think, will put it, the marginalised in history, certainly the marginalised in maritime history. And she has written very extensively on women at sea, on ethnic minorities, on seafarers' well-being and mental health and so on, and on LGBT seafarers, and that is our subject this evening. So Jo is going to talk to us on revealing queer history, international maritime museums, LGBT plus sea exhibitions. Just to say a little about how this will work in practical terms, Jo is going to speak for about 45 minutes as soon as I go quiet. And then we do have a little bit of time for questions and discussion afterwards. There are two ways that you can ask a question. You somewhere will have the option to raise your hand. You should be able to see that on your dashboard. So if you wish to do that, if you wish to ask the question directly, please raise your hand and I will unmute your microphone and invite you to ask the question of Jo directly. Alternatively, and possibly a safer option, you will have a box probably on the right of your screen to type in a question. The box is just labeled questions, and if you would like to type your question in there, then I can read it out on your behalf to Jo. So that's for about 45 minutes time, but in the meantime, I will now go quiet and I will hand over to Dr. Jo Stanley. Over to you, Jo.
Thanks very much, Martin. Hello, everybody. It's such a lovely evening. I wish that we were doing this in person and we could go out in the sunshine afterwards down to the Minerva pub and have a glass of wine in the evening sunshine. But anyway, we'll have to imagine that. So this evening, I'm talking about queer maritime history exhibitions that have happened recently, and I speak as somebody who's either been a curator or consultant or visited most of these exhibitions. And I'll be asking Claire to change slides each time I change slides. And I do hope you'll prepare questions and comments afterwards. It'd be great to have a chat with you all. Thank you. Okay, next slide, Claire, please. So I'm talking about equality, diversity and inclusion. These really important subjects for people who've been marginalised, as Martin says, for far too long, from maritime historiography and from maritime history. So these are stories of both camaraderie and homophobia at sea, in port, and in the seafarers' own homes. I'm talking about 3 overseas maritime museums that have staged LGBT plus exhibitions recently, in chronological order: Canada, Norway and Holland. And the context is other museums that have happened in the UK, Sweden and Barcelona and Rotterdam, which I've crossed through because it was actually a sex and the sea exhibition rather than a queer sea exhibition, but it was similarly daring that it was talking about a new subject for maritime historiography. And of course, it was a different story in different countries and at different times, as the images show. So on the one hand, in the 1950s, on a British ship where there was a cruise show where they were playing at being brownies or Girl Guides, and of course the new climate where it is absolutely cool to be a butch seafarer, which is not actually how it was in the 50s and 60s for real seafarers. Next slide, please, Claire. So in terms of what I'm going to be talking about this evening, in order, there'll be an introduction. Then I'll be talking about the first wave, which happened 2005 to 2011. Then the second wave, which is the more recent one, which really happened from 2021. I'll be comparing the 2 waves and then thinking about what next, and ending with a list of resources you might find useful. So do feel free to take screenshots of the the listing and the chronology too that will be in here. Thank you. Next slide, please, Claire. So it's definitely not about the stereotype of hot-blooded heterosexual sailors and jolly Jack Tars and the women who enthusiastically fell for them. It's not about characters like the illusion we had of the captain of Costa Concordia and the blonde who allegedly caused the shipwreck by chatting him up on the bridge. This is a very different story of seafarers of diverse orientations and identities. Next slide, please, Claire. So the exhibitions that have happened, these are they, as you can see. So first of all, there was the Liverpool one that I co-curated, which then travelled to Southampton, Newcastle and Glasgow in the UK. Then in 2008, Arne Nielsen in Sweden organised one in conjunction with the Maritime Museums in Oslo and Gothenburg. Then in 2010 to 11, Halifax, Nova Scotia imported part of Hello Sailor, the Liverpool exhibition I did, but added their own elements to it, which we'll talk about in a minute. There has been one briefly in Barcelona, and then in 2022, there was one in Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, and then this latest year, there's been the Bergen, Norway one and the Amsterdam, Holland one. And as far as I know, there isn't another one coming up, but the Bergen one has aroused so much interest that there is talk by a number of maritime museums that they too will follow suit and try to do something about queer seafarers. Next slide, please, Claire. So the key things to know, of course, is that gay or queer is a huge, 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 huge world, and we are referring to subjects, not these Tom of Finland type stereotypical icons, but human beings who happen to get wet at work. By contrast to the people who might be struggling to transition from male to female and were secretly taking stilbestrol, the hormonal treatment which you could get in foreign ports, take without supervision and start chemically transitioning in the 1950s, decades before it was easily possible on the NHS in Britain. Next slide, please, Claire. The key things to know that in varying countries it was different. Ships could be hell, or there could be safe gay heavens where you could really feel all right about being out and camp and proud and performative, and that could happen 24 hours of the day, not just in your time off. Being out was normally, in every case we found so far, much easier on passenger ships, even if it was illegal ashore, as it was in most countries being studied in this talk this evening. For many seafarers, and I'm talking about men rather than women now, ports were fantastic places of education that helped people see that there's a whole other way to regard sexuality, that as not just something that dirty perverts did, but was a way of expressing who you were, and that was not remarkable. And the places where this particularly happened were New York, Sydney to a lesser extent, and Singapore, particularly all the bars down Bugis Street. So differently on ships, there was a sense of comradeship and family, the idea of he may be queer, but he's our queer, therefore he's okay. There was a lot of theatricality and making fun, particularly on British ships. It was very much derived from pantomime. And of course, because this was a masculine situation in a period of sexual revolution, having sex with people who were available was quite central to one's identity and the pleasure of one's trip. Next slide, please, Claire. So I'm now talking about representing this history and how it's done. Next slide, Claire, please. And some of the delights in making exhibitions like this, and I have to tell you, everybody I know has really enjoyed making their Queer Sea exhibitions. It's great to be doing something necessary and that is refreshing and new, and with the sense that it's going to make a difference to public perception of queer life and of maritime history. It's absolutely lovely when you work with interviewees and you find that they feel overjoyed that somebody is interested in them, feel overjoyed in telling their story at last, often for the first time, and often they feel vindicated that at last there is a whole exhibition about them. They're not just the people who were tucked away in a corner and maybe sometimes laughed at and certainly denigrated. A lot of the participants we've worked with have enjoyed collaborating as partners in educating posterity, including talking to school kids. And the exhibitions are a particular pleasure to maritime museums because all sorts of new visitors come. Suddenly it's not men of 46, but people of all sorts of backgrounds, very much younger, who often come in specifically to see the temporary queer exhibition rather than the whole exhibition display. Just to give you an example of one of the things we did with Hello Sailor, this is a steward called John's mental map of how he used Sydney. So at the bottom is the P&O berth, then there's the taxi rank, and then there are ways that he went off to the places where he could have all sorts of queer experiences. Manly Beach, the Hasty Tasty Cafe, and Belfield Hotel in their downstairs bar. So this is one of the great things about working with informants, that they can actually show us what it was like for them in various different ports. Thank you. Next slide, please, Claire. So the challenges and issues of making queer maritime exhibitions, above all, it's how do you represent gay? So this was a particular discussion I had with this man, Ron Whitworth, who was a steward who wrote his memoir called Sailing Around My Oyster. And we talked about how on earth, Ron, do we show in our exhibition the gay aspects of your life? We talked about displaying his tapestries. He liked to make tapestry, which we decided was a silly thing to do because seafarers have often done handicrafts. It doesn't say anything about your sexuality or orientation. We talked about using his button box. He'd had a button box on ship full of kind of civilian buttons and merchant navy buttons, and he shared his box around other people, and sometimes he stitched their buttons on for them. We discussed, was this evidence of queer life? No, we thought it wasn't. So this discussion has been very productive for me in advising other museums about how we think about objects that will display queer maritime history. Some of the other issues that museums struggle with is how to tell it in a family-friendly way, and how to deal with the problem that itinerant and stigmatized workers didn't hang on to objects that would reveal this aspect of themselves, particularly when homosexuality was still illegal, because of the shame. They didn't want proofs that would incriminate them or make life difficult. And of course, if you're moving around a lot, changing flats a lot, maybe disconnected from your families of origin, there's nowhere to leave all these proofs of all the times you've had in your life. Sometimes older people, want to tell very happy, jolly camp stories, which can be quite difficult because obviously we want a nuanced story that tells about the complexities of being a queer person on a ship, particularly on cargo ships where you might be treated with some hostility or suspicion, particularly if you're the only gay person aboard. And also there's the difficulty of trying to tell individual stories, but in a collective way, so that we're talking about what it means to be a queer seafarer, and is this person telling the story typical or atypical? What else needs to be said? What are the gaps that need to be filled in? Next slide, please, Claire. So obviously a key question to ask ourselves is, how is exhibiting queer seafarers' lives different to exhibiting any straight transport workers' lives? And the key issues are that it's a secret and stigmatized identity. People were often leading hidden or double lives, particularly officers, particularly deck and engineering workers. So there was so much that they were not revealing. How do we reveal that now? And the other problem, the other major problem, I think, is that unlike, say, a bus conductor, we are trying to tell the story of institutional and individual prejudice in this transport industry. And so it's important to show evidence of the damage to people's careers and feelings. It's important to remember that some seafarers ended up committing suicide because of the shame of being queer and of going home and not being able to express themselves, whereas this wouldn't be so much the case for, say, a bus driver. Next slide, please, Claire. So it's very important to consider what constitutes evidence, and although this is slightly off the point because it's a woman and she's in the Royal Navy, this is Jackie de la Mazière, who was picked up by the Special Investigation Branch of the Navy in 1992 and accused several times of being a lesbian and eventually dismissed. And some of the things that the SIB thought were proof that she was a lesbian were that maybe she would have a black onyx ring. No, she didn't. Maybe she'd have a tattoo on her left shoulder. In fact, she had, but that's because she thought it was the best shoulder. She didn't understand that this was the place where lesbians are supposed to have their tattoos. Did she read The Guardian? The SIB went through her address book. Were these incriminating people? She had CDs and videos. For example, Katie Lang, the lesbian singer. Was this therefore proof that she was a dyke? And believe it or not, tarot cards and incense were also cause for suspecting her, because this proved that she was possibly a witch, possibly a drug taker, because of the idea that incense masked the smell of marijuana. So all these things were seen as indicators of queerness, which of course is bonkers. And so perhaps you can see how difficult the problem is when you're thinking about how to find evidence for an exhibition. Next slide, please, Claire. Because it's so hard to find objects as well as stories, some of the solutions that have been used are faking it, so using replicas, like in this picture of the Hello Sailor exhibition at Merseyside Maritime Museum, where lots of things were bought from shops that men had talked about, but they didn't still possess. So the items that were most important to me was that lovely flouncy orange dress sticking out of the wardrobe. And that's because a seafarer had told me the story of going into a cabin for his first time on a ship and seeing a gorgeous ball dress and uniform trousers, and seeing gold stiletto heel sandals placed next to black uniform shoes. And I thought this was a real proof of the duality that there could be in shipboard life. So also people creating exhibitions use artists, and at Liverpool we used an actor and a script. That's Jay sitting on the bunk in his white steward's jacket, being instructed by one of the informants who helped us with the exhibition, who'd been a purser. And also what museums often do is to take the subject wide, so to include not just seafarers, but people involved in the maritime world generally, and in the Royal Navy as well as the Merchant Navy. Next slide, please, Claire. So I'm now going to talk a bit about the Wave 1 exhibitions from 2005, which were the Hello Sailor one. It's in its reincarnations in these places. And then Arnie Nielsen's exhibition in Oslo and Gothenburg, and then the Hello Sailor in its new reincarnation in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Next slide, please, Claire. So the Hello Sailor exhibition grew out of a book that research that Paul Baker and I wrote. Paul was then an expert on Polari, the gay language. He's what's called a lavender linguist. So we had created this book together, and then Merseyside Maritime Museum bravely decided that it would be an exhibition. And this is the main picture we use, which is of a party on a ship. And the person at the front is called Miss Everton, 1956. This was the year that Everton did very well in the football, apparently. So it included 13 panels, 1 glass showcase, 1 cabin set, which you just saw with Jay sitting in there, 3 audios, you know, the handsets you pick up and you hear people giving testimony, a display of mental maps like the one of John's that you just saw of Sydney, and the actor Jay doing explanatory talks. Next slide, please, Claire. What we found when we did this exhibition were that a lot of people in Liverpool denied that they were gay and that that was gay life on sea. So it seemed that it was very much a Southampton and South Coast story, which didn't feel quite real, really. So that was one of our difficulties in research. We made the decision that it would be conveyed as the fun life it was. We wouldn't talk about suicide or sexual experiences. It was designed to be portable, to fit in the back of a 30 weight van. And initially, there was some unease by the trustees of the museum, and Tony Tibbles, the director, said in that case all the more reason to put the exhibition on to educate people rather than to let the hostility and stigmatizing continue. So we did a survey afterwards, and the responses were generally very positive. Mainly it was young people who went to it rather than older people. The exhibition became part of the permanent exhibition and was on for years and years and years, and lots of visitors from overseas who were curators at maritime museums came over to study the exhibition and think about, was this a template? Would they do something like that themselves? Could they risk it at that time in doing it in their country? How would they approach it differently? How would they get these objects? And how would they do it sensitively? Next slide, please, Claire. So in Sweden, Arnie Nielsen did his exhibition called Frizone. There weren't many objects and there weren't many stories that he'd recorded, and so artists' impressions and huge images of gay seafarers were used in this exhibition. Next slide, please, Claire. And then in Halifax, Nova Scotia, I went over for the opening of that, and do you know, I didn't know maritime museums could rock, but this maritime museum rocked with all the drag queens there. And the way Halifax dealt with the exhibition being so UK focused was that they got local stories, including from Royal Navy people, and they did lots of consultation. And very interestingly, afterwards, the museum participated for the first time in the Pride Parade in Halifax. Next slide, please, Claire. Now, I'm now going to talk about wave 2 in Victoria and Bergen and Amsterdam. Next slide, please, Claire. But just to intervene, there was briefly this art-based exhibition in Barcelona, where they again used art rather than seafarer informants to deal with the absence of objects. You can look up a good review of that in The Guardian. Next slide, please, Claire. And then in Canada, in Victoria. So this Queer at Sea exhibition again made the decision, like Halifax, to go wide and include not only Royal Naval personnel, but also a lesbian diver, recreational sailors, and a tugboat union activist. In 2 rooms, they had panels with quite a lot of text on, gathered from 15 story givers, and the responses were very positive. But interestingly to me, even in 2022, there was hostility to this exhibition. And so when the curator first announced it on Facebook, she had to take that Facebook announcement down because of the negative comments that were posted by some people. Next slide, please, Claire. So the curator was Heather Feeney, and the features that she gathered, she knows a lot about labour history, the features she gathered included discovering that there were no iconic queer ships in Canada as there were in Britain. The Andes was called the queerest ship afloat. There was nothing like this in Canada. There was nothing so camp. People were careful not to be out. Seafarers were not gay activists. They didn't speak Polari, this secret language on ships. And Tony Rose, this former engineer, told me this very interesting story that people absolutely assumed he was a paedophile just because he was gay. And in 1972, he was offered a job, and then immediately that offer was retracted when they realized that he was gay. They didn't want him on the premises. So there's 2 ways you can read about this. Well, in fact, there's 3. There's my summary of it at Lloyd's Heritage Foundation website. You can hear a podcast by the British Columbia Museums Association, and you can see lots and lots of pictures on Facebook of this exhibition. Next slide, please, Claire. Relatedly, in 2022, Bergen Maritime Museum put on this exhibition, Queer Sea Folk. It was curated by Gree Bang Anderson and Bard Graham Auckland. They had 5, again, they used art quite a lot. They had 5 bays with different things happening, including using audio of the interviews they'd done. Since then, they've gone on to do a lot of interviews and a lot of talks with other museums. It's really snowballed. So you can read about it there, where I've written info. Next slide, please, Claire. And in doing their research, they found that it was quite a quiet culture, unlike the loud, flamboyant, outrageous British one. Again, as in Canada, there was no particular iconic ship. It was less pantomimic than on UK ships, less frisky. And again, like the UK, there was much more queer activity and fun making on passenger ships than on cargo ships. People didn't speak Polari or the Norwegian equivalent. Some of the outcomes of them putting on this exhibition was that they got many more informants who passed on stories and have been recorded. Again, like in Liverpool, they got lots of younger visitors to the exhibition, but not necessarily converting to the bigger Maritime Museum. They've done an impressive number of talks on radio, TV, on teams and to schools, got lots of articles done. They're talking at various maritime museums. And for me, what's very interesting is that they're talking to a whaling museum in Sandefjord, which is actually thinking of doing an exhibition about queer seafarers in whaling, which would be quite tricky to do because, of course, whaling is now over, so there would be no seafarers to give that story. They're also linking with their universities' queer archives, and there's 2 articles forthcoming. Next slide, please, Claire. In Amsterdam, Bob van der Pol has put on an exhibition called Queer Spaces at Sea, and the items in this have included the first ever filmed interview of queer seafarers, Charles and Gillis. There's a study space there with books on queer history, interactive activities, and he has gathered 5 oral interviews and is going to do more. As a result, there's going to be his dissertation, which is just about done, 2 articles, and at last some information about women's side of the story. There is a bit of information from his interviewees about lesbian women on ships, and he is doing some events. Next slide, please, Claire. So Bob's findings about Dutch queer seafaring history is that there was one specific ship. It was as famously, iconically queer as the Andes in Britain, and it's the Rotterdam. And you can still go to it today because it's a hotel and museum and conference venue. You can actually walk where all these gay guys had their pretty free times in the 70s. So Bob found that there was very much a gay community of about 20 on his ships, as opposed to the 70 to 100 odd on British ships. They sat at the same mess tables. And as with Britain, when they went to foreign ports, they tended to visit art galleries rather than brothels and pubs. Although in the US and the UK, shipping companies consciously selected gay stewards because of their attributed characteristics, Holland America Line, the main line, didn't consciously select gay men. Bob also found some lesbian women. He found harassment, and he'll be telling the story of the difficulties, not just the joy. And he can also talk about the way some Dutch men switch ships to work on British ships. So Charles, who you saw in the last picture, did switch to work on the Queen Mary. Next slide, please, Claire. So just comparing how these ways were different. Next slide, please, Claire. In earlier times, there were more informants around because obviously these seafarers were particularly unusual and therefore worth recording for their experiences in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Quite a few of them have died now. There was much less openness and a much more homophobic reception to the exhibitions and to obviously to guys actually on the ships at the time. There was much less nuanced understanding then than there is now. I feel particularly uncomfortable that I didn't understand trans and drag life enough on ship and how important it was. In those early days, there was more chance of artifacts still existing. Now there's very few. There was less technology, so there were no films made of interviewees, and there were no Zoom-based interviews, whereas now Bergen Maritime Museum is doing lots of Zoom-based interviews that will be part of archives for posterity. There were fewer women and certainly fewer lesbian women around in the past on those ships, and there was much less use of social media to talk about those exhibitions, whereas these last 3 exhibitions have been talked a lot on Facebook particularly, and to a lesser extent on LinkedIn. Next slide, please, Claire. So what next? Next slide. I'm hoping that there'll be exhibitions in Australia and the US, and some of the articles that have been done in Holland and Norway will be produced in English. There will be comparative work, we hope, done on queer use of ports worldwide. I'm hoping many more memoirs will be written as a result of some seafarers seeing that people have done that. And I'm hoping that seafarers will be open in saying me too, in talking about the problems which include bullying and sexual abuse on ships. I'm hoping too that there'll be links to university departments. Certainly this is happening in Antwerp now, which is very active in talking about queer seafarers use of ports. So because of some of the knowledge that we've gained from doing this work, we can offer consultancy to help future exhibitions. We're hoping there'll be publications. We can connect people with seafarers who can speak about their queer lives, if only on Zoom. And there can be lots of network, we hope, which will fertilize other initiatives. Next slide, please, Claire. So some of the things that are happening that we're going further, there's now a Rainbow Seas in Maritime Museums group that's set up. We meet once every 2 months on Zoom. You're welcome to join us for the next one in September. There's articles emerging. I do a lot of blog items and social media items, so you can keep up with what's going on through those. Some of my talks are videoed. Some people are writing memoirs, like Kenneth Brophy, who is got Liverpool connections, who speaks English with a Liverpool accent, but is very much a Norwegian, who started the first queer seafarers bar in Norway. And there's also a TV series currently developing, which will be shown in the UK and the US if it gets off the ground. There's lots of recordings and transcripts of interviews in the Sailing Proud archive at Liverpool Maritime Museum, and there is a Pride in Maritime network that has regular meetings every couple of months. The link's there for you. Next slide, please, Claire. So these are some of the ways you can find out much more, and these are in English. So Arnie's written an article. Bob's written his thesis, which is going to be available soon. Homotopia's filmed an interview with me touring around the exhibition, so you'll be able to see some of the exhibition. And I've also talked about queer maritime history on YouTube and in my my blog. Worldwide, I have done a Queer Seas bibliography, which you can look at and add to. Please add to it. And similarly, I've done a Queer Seas timeline, so showing queer maritime history from 1600 to today. So again, please do join in and amend that. Next slide, please, Claire. I'm just going to skip that one. Next one, Claire. So how does queer seafaring's past help the future? I think it's really important because it gives us hope for the human race's potential to be generous and embrace difference. This history has proved that tolerance of the other is possible, that openness to diversity keeps on increasing at the moment rather than decreasing, and it's shown that fear and normativity can be replaced by inclusivity. This has happened again and again on ships in these different countries, and the exhibitions evidence this. Next slide, please, Claire. So that's my lot. Do be in touch and do join in with comments and questions now. This is an informal situation, and you are welcome to say whatever you wish. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jo. That was fascinating. Thoroughly enjoyed that. So we do now have a few minutes for questions, slightly more minutes. You run rather under time, Jo, if I may say so. So we do have a few minutes for questions now. So if people would like to raise a hand or type them in the chat box, I will just check and see if we have any raised hands so far. So yes, please do feel free to ask any questions. In the meantime, I think I'm going to abuse chair's privilege, Jo, and ask one of my own, which is, I mean, fascinating stuff, and it's great that this is happening. And inevitably, it tends to relate very much to 20th century seafaring, doesn't it?
Yes.
Particularly, obviously, interviews. How much scope would there be for going further back? I mean, presumably it would be very difficult, would it?
Almost not. Almost not, actually. It's a really good question. I mean, the point is, it's been such a hidden history because it's been so stigmatized. You know, you could display some naval records of tribunals, but they don't say very much. And obviously, you want to know about what it's like for the seafarer themselves, not for the person judging them. There are some newspaper articles, including early 20th century ones, lots of them about seafarers hooking up with what seem to be guys who live a straight life normally on land, and this happens particularly in Plymouth and Portsmouth. But really, you can't tell this story without the oral history, without the generosity of the seafarers who are still alive and who may even have the occasional object that they can share. For example, Ron's button box, except, as I said, it's no real evidence.
Yes, I mean, you'd be very much limited to the court-martial records, wouldn't you? And that's
Yeah.
a very one-sided story, as you say. In the meantime, I must apologise. There was a hand raised. Allow me to just try and unmute you, Manikana, if you have a question. I think you're self-muted, so you should be able to unmute your microphone. Oh, hang on. Right, yes, I can see this raised hand, but unfortunately I can't unmute you. It says, Claire, would you be able to help here, possibly?
Hi, I think I've been able to unmute myself.
Yep.
And hi, Jo, this is Mani here, and I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. I think your exhibitions, they're so enlightening. I think my question is very close to the one asked by Martin, is that because I'm a historian, of the 19th century and early 20th, so that's exactly what I was thinking on the lines that, I was thinking on the perspective of maybe like when we are talking about gay men, as you said, obviously, because there are very few people who would perhaps come out and actually acknowledge and talk about it. But what about maybe references to mental health, or terming themselves maybe as, like, I don't know, as mentally ill people, or I don't know, like, have you maybe kind of come across sources related to that?
No,
You do
because
mention newspaper reports, and yeah, because I would love to explore that bit actually. So that's what I was asking.
okay, well, the odd bits that are in newspapers, they're brief and they're sort of disdainful. They refer critically to these seafarers who got up to dirty behaviour, say in back alleys in obscure port towns. They're tiny items. They don't. The knowledge they give you is really the knowledge of straight and public attitudes of the period. So, I mean, we can extrapolate from that how stigmatized and pilloried, perhaps, some of these guys were, but these are stories of opportunistic pickups. They're not stories of relationships. And the court-martial records are normally about non-consensual sex and sex by senior officers with lower ranked people. So that the problem of that is that it's a threat to the order, to the hierarchy on ship. So there's no place really where mental health is talked about as it should be. I mean, I guess a very long shot might be to look in late 19th century mental hospital records and see if there are any patients there who were seafarers who'd been incarcerated for their sex lives. But I haven't tried that. Might be worth a go, but it is a long shot.
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating. Thank you.
If I could interject there, actually, Jo, I think that might be worth an idea. I had a friend some years ago who worked through some psychologists' records from these from the 1950s, and they effectively were sectioning people for, or at least treating them for saying, as he put it, saying "hello, sailor" on Gould Docks. So, I mean, that's one isolated example from one practitioner, but there was a documentary.
Yeah. Where would you find such documents, Martin, do you think?
Well, this was not in an archive. This was a friend who worked for a document management company and just happened to have seen this and knew I had an interest in this field. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, it suggests these records were kept. Whether you would find them in archives, I do not know.
Well, I do know that most mental hospital archives do still exist. So this would be a local search job, wouldn't it, in regional archives, probably? Yeah.
And also very heavily subject to data protection legislation.
Yeah. Oh, and maybe at the Wellcome. Maybe the Wellcome Institute would be a good place to go to ask about this. You know, it has a good archive. Yeah. Good luck. Love to hear what happens.
We have a question and an observation in the chat box. I'll hold back the observation for a moment, but the question from Gina Bardi, I'll read it out verbatim. Thank you for this great talk. I'm really interested in pets at sea, like dogs and cats. Have you seen any correlation? Oh, hang on, sorry, another question's popped up and it's disappeared off my screen. Please bear with me a second. Have you seen any correlation between taking care of animals with the queer community as a way to show love and affection without being outed, as caring for an animal is an acceptable, in quotation marks, way of having these feelings that are seen as more feminine?
What an absolutely fascinating question. Thank you. I haven't seen any evidence of this. I've seen evidence of seafarers being exceptionally fond of cats, but I haven't seen it in relation to their sexual orientation and identity. I think the person to speak to about this would be Sari Mainpää, the Finnish historian who's done an exhibition about pets at sea. She's quite visible if you Google her, or if you approach me, I'll give you her email address. And Sari may have noticed something like this. It is a brilliant question, and it does figure, doesn't it, that people would find ways of expressing affection in this way. Thank you for it.
We've had an observation in the chat box from Colin Dewey for a 19th century Atlantic stroke American perspective. And it says, look at Matthew Knipp, Melville's Queer Hauntology, selections from the erotic journals of marine drummer Philip C. Van Buskirk. And that's in Leviathan 22 in 2020. Thank you for that. I will certainly go and look at that. It sounds most interesting.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And I'll
Give
add
me
that
while I make a quick note.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure technically how I can save that, Martin. So could you save it and bung it over to me, please?
I can
save it for you.
Thanks,
can you do
Claire.
that, please?
Thank you.
Because I'm
Thanks.
struggling with it a bit.
That's great, and I'll add it to my Queer Seafarers bibliography too. Thank you very much for that. It's brilliant. I'd love to know how you came across it.
Do we have any further questions? See no further hands up. Well, in that case, I will close with the observation in the chat box, also from Colin. Says no question, but thank you so much, Jo. I hope we can get something going in San Francisco.
That would be great, and New York as well, maybe. I think these two ports definitely deserve such an exhibition, and San Fran would be great. I'll just say in case people don't know, that Alan Berube, the queer historian, did some work on the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union, which was very queer from the 1930s, and Alan's work is available in public, but also somebody should work on the archive that's been left, because this is very important stuff that it seems like in the US was at least 20 years ahead of us in being open about queer seafarers.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, and it is now a case of speak now or forever hold your peace. So in that case, we'll draw things to a close. And I'd just like to finish with two thank yous. The first is to Claire, who has so efficiently managed all of this behind the scenes. And the second is, of course, to Jo. So thank you very much, Jo, for a really fascinating talk. It's been really good to hear this tonight. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Martin, for chairing it. Thank you, Blaydes, for hosting it. I think it's really important to be talking about EDI in maritime history. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, one and all, and a good night.